52 years ago, in a small town in northern Ontario, a woman developed a mysterious condition that left doctors baffled and her children terrified. It was a condition as old as civilization itself: demonic possession. Her case is one of the most extreme ever recorded, but most of it remained a secret, with the psychiatric hospital going so far as to delete the records for fear of leaks. Today, we will hear the testimony of the only person who knows the truth about this story: her son. My name is Michael Anthony, and I am 56 years old. The first time I went to the table, my mother called me over, and then she came up behind me and poured hot soup on my shoulder. I was about 3.5 or 4 years old at the time. That was my first memory of my mother actually existing and that I needed to be cautious around her. From those days, as far as I can remember, she never hugged me, never touched me, never said it's okay, never kissed me. There was no kind of affection. But my sister, who is 7 years older than me, told me that before I was born, our grandpa passed away, and it left my mother extremely distressed. My aunt, my mother's sister, was a very spiritual person and involved in the occult. My mother and my sister tried to conjure their father's spirit because they missed him dearly. As you know, this is forbidden in both the Old and New Testament because it works. Whether it was his spirit or a demonic impersonation pretending to be him, whatever it truly was, it started the oppression. According to my sister's memory, this began just before I was born and worsened as I grew up. As I said, there was no affection. She never kissed me, never hugged me, not even after the soup spilling incident. I remember taking a taxi to the doctor. She never touched me, never held me. We went to the doctor. I remember being in the waiting room, in agony and pain, whimpering, and she never comforted me, never touched me. On the way back home, this really heightened my perception of my mother as someone not to be trusted. As I learned from my sister and aunt, she was very desolate, missing our father, and from then on, things only got worse. I was born shortly after that, and at that point, she was already losing touch with reality, or close to it. But I think it got worse when I started preschool. Everything I've described happened in Etobicoke and Mississauga, neighborhoods of Toronto. When we moved to Meaford, it was a turning point. We moved 190 kilometers away from all my family to a small, isolated town in northern Ontario, Canada. I'm not sure of the reason. Maybe there was a family feud, as they never visited us again. From there, isolated in this small town, my mother began to deteriorate progressively. She became very distant, started talking to herself, which was the first thing I noticed. She began to complain to us that she was hearing voices, and this was the main thing she mentioned. At that time, there were scratchings on the walls, bangings and knockings, things like that. My mother claimed she saw little people, something curious here in Canada. Over time, she increasingly lost her essence. When I was 6, 7, 8 years old, she was practically in another world, talking to herself all the time, basically oblivious to my and my sister's presence. My father worked away 5 or 6 days a week, going back to Toronto, where we had moved from. So, it was just the three of us at home. The situation worsened, and by the time I was 9 or 10, it had significantly escalated. But before we continue, I want to connect this to something that happened earlier. It's hard to condense everything, but as I understand, around the age of 7, I was basically left to my own devices in almost everything. How could a 7-year-old, my mother didn't even acknowledge that my sister and I existed? How did we manage to take care of ourselves, to eat and all that? I don't know how my sister did it, but we had some food at home, not much. My father fished and hunted when he had free time, so we had something in the freezer. As for going to the grocery store, my father only went once every 2 or 3 months. I started inviting myself over to friends' houses to eat, and if those friends realized, they would say, "Oh, now I understand. I did a lot of that." In the summer, someone in our community, where the backyards were all connected without fences, had a huge garden, about half an acre with every kind of vegetable. I would go there, pick lettuces, carrots, wash them in the stream next to my neighbor's house, and eat. We lived in a place called Niagara Escarpment in northern Canada, where, during the summer and fall, there are many edible things around like wild grapes, cherries, pears, and lots of apple trees. Most of my meals were at friends' houses or whatever I could get, usually from trees. It's crazy to think that a 7-year-old had to fend for himself and find food like that. When I went to the neighbor's garden, since my mother was completely out of touch with reality, did the neighbors suspect something? They know I was taking food from the garden? Did I get into trouble? Yes, indeed. The large garden I mentioned belonged to a man named Herbie, a very old gentleman in his 90s who walked with a cane. I would steal vegetables from his garden and he would come out the back door yelling at me. He had no teeth, so I could never understand what he was saying, but I knew he couldn't catch me, so it was kind of a cat and mouse game, but he wasn't very good at it. In the winter, I also stole snacks at school from other kids' lunchboxes. In Canada, we have a winter coat closet where you take off your boots and put snacks on the top shelf. During class changes, I would sneak up to the closet, shut the door, grab an apple or something, and eat it quickly before the next class. I remember a few times there were announcements over the PA system asking whoever was stealing the snacks to stop. I really thought they were talking about someone else, not me, but after hearing it so many times, I thought, my God, they're talking about me. I really didn't think I was stealing, just surviving. It was very strange growing up without parental support and having to fend for myself when you're just a child, trying to understand and explain the world in your own way. I never thought there was anything wrong with my mother. I just thought she was weird, crazy. I don't know, and we kept living. I didn't realize how bad my childhood had been until I started suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder in my 20s. That's when I began to reassess my life and realized that when I told people, they were shocked. Dude, that's not normal. You only know what you see around you, and that was all I had. It's like the saying about the frog in the boiling water not realizing the danger as the temperature gradually increases. You're not aware of the end, you just survive day by day. Listeners might wonder if I barely had food, what about other things like washing clothes? I didn't. Occasionally, I would throw my clothes in the bathtub with me, and that was laundry day. Basically, I was a wild child with a roof over my head. Looking back now, I see how strange it was. How did the other kids see me? Well, nobody really noticed anything because I was a top student. I had very strong ADHD and, with everything I was going through, was deeply traumatized. But I saw school as a place where I needed to excel at everything. I didn't get attention at home, so I felt I had to make up for it in school. I won all the competitions and got high grades. You'd think the opposite, that someone with a chaotic life would do poorly in school, but I took the opposite approach. I wasn't hiding anything, not trying to cover up, just striving to do my best in everything. No one noticed, and many people who went to school with me have read my book and said they would have never guessed. Although indeed I was teased for wearing dirty clothes at school, I didn't know the etiquette of when to wash clothes or how dirty they should be before being considered dirty. Back in the 70s and early 80s, there weren't as many alerts for children in difficult situations. There were other kids who showed up at school as dirty as I was, kind of like Pigpen from Charlie Brown, and everyone just thought, oh, that kid is poor, or they're not well taken care of. There wasn't a big mobilization for kids who seemed to have trouble at home. I'm not sure when it started, but every night I was terrified of my mother, and my sister was very scared of her too. I think around the age of 9 or 10, things started to get significantly worse. I never saw my sister, despite us growing up together. She stayed in her room at the end of the hall with a lock on the inside, and I hardly ever saw her. During this time, my mother was progressively getting worse, screaming in the middle of the night, sitting in a chair, hitting herself with a piece of wood until she bled and laughed, speaking in several different voices. I would be in the living room with her watching TV, and she would talk to herself in strange voices and have conversations. I never understood anything, and only 20 years later did I realize that she was speaking in different languages because I didn't understand a word she said. But every night, as soon as the sun set, things started to get worse, and I tried to leave the house as much as possible. Sometimes I even slept in the park. I really didn't want to go back home. I was terrified, but still, I would go back, go to my room, and fill all the drawers of my dresser with bricks, about 20 or more, and push the furniture against the door. I always slept in the same fetal position, with a hockey stick by my side, waiting, because every night around 2 or 3 in the morning, my mother would come and shake the door trying to get in. When she couldn't, she would start screaming and pacing the hall. I remember one particular night, driven by curiosity, after she shook the door, I pushed the dresser aside and peeked down the hall as she walked away, screaming and hitting herself on the head with a winter boot before she went back to her room and slammed the door. This was a nightly routine, and I can't remember when it stopped. I think it only ceased when she tried to kill one of us and was taken to an asylum in a straitjacket. Every night, she repeated this ritual of checking my door to see if she could get in, and I waited for it every night. I don't even know what to say. I slept in the same position without moving all night, and the bed even had marks from my body, so much that I stayed in that position until I left home. I was at school when someone knocked on the door, and there were men in suits waiting for me. The teacher called me out to the hallway where there were police officers. I got in the car with the neighbor, whose father came to pick me up, and as we were driving home, he told me that my mother had tried to kill my sister. She was chasing my sister around the car with a butcher knife trying to kill her, and the man who drove me home witnessed everything. That day, they took my mother to a mental institution and put her in a straitjacket. When my sister told what happened, she said she was in the living room and our mother in the kitchen when she heard our mother scream that she was a witch and needed to be killed. My sister only escaped because that morning I had left the front door and the screen door open, which allowed her to get out quickly. My sister said that saved her life because if she had to open the doors, our mother would have caught her. My sister left that week and went to live with our grandmother in Toronto, where we had come from. As for me, I didn't have much of a reaction. It was more of an, oh, okay. But when they took my mother, I thought, wow, finally, I'm going to be able to sleep tonight without someone trying to get into my room. I never understood her intentions or what was happening. People asked why we didn't call a priest for an exorcism, but we were just kids and had no idea what we were dealing with. Everyone thought she was just crazy, and my dad was almost never home, so it was just the three of us. What do you expect kids to do in that situation? My reaction was pretty melancholic, except for the relief of thinking, now things will get better, since I was still a minor, 13 years old, and still living at home. But 3 months later, she was brought back. I found out she had voluntarily admitted herself to the psychiatric hospital, and by law, if you admit yourself voluntarily, you can ask to leave. She was a very intelligent woman, despite everything, as she managed to be accepted back home 3 months after having tried to kill one of her children. I was shocked that they let her return without a trial or anything, since she had admitted herself voluntarily. I don't really know how that worked. It was a different time. When she came back, things got worse. Before I continue, I'll tell you that I spoke to a man a few years ago when I was writing my first book. He was a priest in Ontario, Canada, in the 70s and 80s. He told me that, by the protocol of the time, she must have done something very strange in the hospital because if it was something beyond their diagnosis, that's why they sent her back, not being able to find anything wrong with her. Something supernatural or paranormal, probably, because when I researched for my second book and called the hospital asking for her records, initially they told me they would probably have been burned, but later they informed me they were archived off-site. They offered me the records for $35, but after a week with no news, when I called again, they said there were no records of her. An exorcist I spoke with explained that this would be the protocol to archive records off-site because something unusual happened while she was under their care, something that was documented but without diagnosis. When I mentioned I was researching for a book, the records just disappeared. My sister had already left, so it was just me at home. On the first day after her return, I remember seeing her walking around the house and I just ran away. I was very shaken by everything, but in the days following her return, she spent all her time sitting in her chair, hitting herself with a piece of wood until she was all bloody from sunrise to sunset. I remember going out during the day and coming back at night just before the sunset. I would leave my bike outside, and as we always left the windows open at that time, I could hear the thumps of her hitting herself in the chest with the piece of wood. She repeated this bizarre act while talking to herself in different voices, non-stop, every day until the sun set. Then she would retreat to her room and the noises would start. From the living room to her bedroom were only 6 or 8 running steps. I would hear noises as if people were fighting, similar to the sound of when my friend and I would wrestle at his house, which had a hollow floor that echoed. It sounded like people were rolling on the floor, fighting for their lives. I would run to her room, open the door, and find her lying in bed with the blanket pulled up to her nose, her eyes wide open, saying that Satan was jumping on her chest, coming from the ceiling. I didn't know what to do. I heard all those noises, but there she was, motionless in bed. And remember, she was obese at that time, so she didn't move quickly, but every night this circus of events repeated itself. I remember once when she found some of my belongings. We didn't have much because she burned everything. She threw my things into the fireplace until everything caught fire, and a neighbor called the firefighters. They came in and started dismantling the fireplace while she continued to hit herself with a piece of wood just 3 feet away from me. I watched everything, and as I mentioned, only 20 years later did I realize that no one said a word. The firefighters saw her all bloody, extinguished the fire, and left. That's how it was in the 70s and 80s. Nobody talked about these things. Nobody said anything bad about anyone. Everything was kept secret. As I said, my mother never pampered me, never hugged me, never kissed me throughout my childhood, never talked to me because she was oppressed from a very young age and later possessed, so I never really knew her. We never had conversations. But there were 2 times when she spoke to me coherently and intelligently. Both times occurred when I was at home about to leave. She didn't try to get my attention. She was humming and whistling, and suddenly she stopped hitting herself and said, "They're entering me and climbing up my spine. That's how they get into me." And after that, she returned to her previous state. Both times, she told me exactly the same thing, at intervals of about 30 seconds, and these were the only times I heard her speak with her normal voice. At that time, I think I was about 16, and understandably, my mindset was that if I didn't kill her first, she would end up killing me, as she tried to do with my sister. It seemed like I had no help from anyone. The mental institute did nothing, the police did nothing, so I really saw no other option. There was one night that was a crucial turning point in my story. Up to that point, I was mentally and emotionally crumbling. My grades started to drop for the first time because I couldn't cope with everything anymore. I was being broken on all levels, feeling just like an empty shell. Things got so bad that my dad couldn't leave food at home because she ate everything voraciously, so he put a chain on the freezer in the basement. One summer afternoon, when I was coming home by bike, I went down to the basement to perhaps chop wood, and I saw my mother trying to saw the chain off the freezer with a hacksaw. The only thing I could do was shout, "Hey!" When I saw her, she was all hunched over, turned her head, looked at me, and growled. She was unkempt and smelly, her hair grown over her forehead, her teeth all broken and jagged, to the point that her tongue, which she showed me from time to time, was cut and bleeding at the edges. She then dropped the hacksaw and ran upstairs, and I ran after her. At that moment, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to decide between her or me. Someone was going to end up dead sooner or later. She beat me in the race upstairs, entered her room, and slammed the door so hard that all the windows in the house vibrated, seeming like they would shatter. When I tried to open the door, she was pressing against it, making it crack. I imagined she was using her back and feet to push in a position of strength. I waited a minute, listening to her breathing and growling on the other side. When she eased the pressure on the door, I wiped my hands due to the sweat, turned the knob, and opened the door quickly. Our eyes met immediately, just 10 feet away from each other. Her eyes, which were naturally green, seemed like pits of darkness, very different from the bright eyes she had, which always stood out. I didn't see anything, just the reflection of the light in her eyes, which were just black spheres. I've read about people who have seen things like this, and it sounds so cliche, but I don't know how else to explain it. There was no pupil, no iris. Everything was completely black. At that moment, she had a handful of coins in her hand and threw them at my face. I turned around and started running. She ran after me. I ran, turned the corner, opened the door, and went out onto the street. Then I heard a bang. She had gone back to her room and slammed the door. All the windows vibrated again, and I could see this from outside, thinking they were going to burst like a speaker. Outside, trying to process what I had seen, I could barely say my name. The depth of the trauma was such that I couldn't control my speech or my body. I then realized that my dad was in town. It was a Saturday. Fortunately, our phone was right at the entrance next to the living room door. So, making sure the coast was clear, I picked up the phone and went to the patio to call my dad. When the operator connected the call, I couldn't speak at all. My dad understood it was me and said he was coming. When he arrived, he asked what had happened, but I was still in shock. We went inside together, and suddenly, my mother, an obese and not very tall woman, surprised my dad by jumping on him. She knocked him down and began scratching his face and growling like an animal. My dad managed to get up and ran outside, and I followed him. In the patio, he looked incredulous, as if he didn't recognize the woman he had married. Still with the phone nearby, he called the police, who in turn called the mental institution. My mother talked to the police in a normal way, as if nothing had happened, even questioning why they were there. Minutes later, they took her away. I remember they kept me back. Perhaps they didn't want me to see my mother being put in a straitjacket. I wanted to see her, but I couldn't. She was taken back to the mental institution and 3 months later was released again after voluntarily committing herself. My dad still wasn't present in her life. He continued working the same job, still away, and just thought she was crazy and ignored her, not paying any attention to her. One thing you need to understand about my dad is that he grew up during World War II, saw his own father get shot by Nazis. They were trying to take shelter in Italy, where my family and my dad are from. He was just a boy when a bomb exploded and killed his donkey, throwing the animal's entrails on him and other children. He had a very traumatic life, so now I understand why he didn't react to anything and just thought she was crazy, because he didn't spend time with her. He had an escape. Today I know that demonic entities that possess someone just want to hide, block people's feelings so they don't realize they are possessed, and they allowed my mother to speak at that moment. When they took her, who knows what happened? But they don't go away. They're still in her. They just have control. That's why they climb up the spine and enter the head, because the central nervous system, the control of the entire body, is in the spinal column. I've studied this for the last 30 years, and this is what demons do. There is a process by which they enter and take control of the central nervous system, and that's why people have strange movements. The longer it went on, the more demons were allowed to take refuge in her, more voices and more different dialects I heard while she sat talking all day, seemingly arguing with no one, with her voice changing. And that's what they do. If the demons were to inhabit a part of the body that controls the limbs, it would be the spinal cord. So this makes sense, and that's what my mother said. When he came back home, it was usually for 2 days, maybe 1 night, and 2 days, and he had his own room because we had a 4-bedroom house. Even when he was home, he was never really at home. He was either fishing or hunting, activities he loved, being in nature. As I mentioned, my dad only went to school up to the 4th grade because of the war in Italy, was a refugee for years, and came to Canada at 19. He had a very traumatic life, and even today, we never talk about those things. We never discuss it. My dad is 90 years old now, and I wouldn't dare bring it up. I don't want him to have to go through all that again. He knows he failed me. I told him he could have done better, but that is in the past. There is something called forgiveness, and I forgave my father because I know he too suffered traumas in his childhood. He wasn't fully present, to put it mildly. He had trouble adapting, didn't speak the language, and had to deal with moving to a new country, all of which was very difficult. However, the story isn't over yet. Eventually, I left home. That was the last straw. The night of the incident with my mother and my father's attempt to help. It wasn't long after that I decided to leave. I don't remember exactly how old I was at the time. I had to wait until I was 18 to be able to leave legally, so I spent my time at friends' houses and planned my departure. I decided to go to Toronto, live with my sister, save money, and then go to California to get into the music business, as I was a guitarist. I did that, spent a year in Toronto, saved up money, and at 18, went back home. I managed to convince a few friends to go to California with me. We set the date for April 1987, but as the date approached, everyone backed out except one, who bailed a week before. I decided to go anyway. On Good Friday, I took a bus in Buffalo, New York, and 3 days later, on the Monday after Easter Sunday of 1987, I arrived in California. I wanted to leave Canada for good, wanted nothing more to do with that place. At 18, 19, I was suffering from severe insomnia, bulimia. I was 6 feet tall, weighed 123 pounds, and had a 23-inch waist. I was anorexic and bulimic, constantly vomiting, hated myself, and saw no value in myself. When I arrived in California, I had 15 minutes of happiness when I sat on the beach in Santa Monica at 11 in the morning, put my feet in the sand, and there was almost no one around. I put my backpack in the sand, lay down, and thought, no one knows where I am. This is the greatest moment of my life. I have no bills. I owe nothing to anyone. That feeling lasted about 15 minutes, and then I thought, now what am I going to do? I was still suffering from severe insomnia, able to sleep only 2 or 3 hours a night because I was shaking so much. To this day, at 56, I still shake and feel internal tremors as if something is happening to me every night and every morning. I wake up with facial paralysis, feeling my face numb and on fire. Post-traumatic stress disorder was terrible, and what I went through for so many years manifested in various ways. When I was 19, I began to have horrific nightmares, insomnia, and bulimia. Over the next decade, I developed depression, anxiety, and death tendencies. Now I'm back to feeling tremors, shakes, and facial paralysis. It's like you see videos of World War I soldiers with shell shock, all shaking, because their systems were so traumatized they couldn't function properly. And that's what I have. During our conversation, I sometimes thought I was going to pass out, which has happened several times during periods of high stress. I've been to the hospital so many times that I have a medical history as long as my arm. You would expect this from someone with post-traumatic stress disorder due to this situation. So, for those who write saying they don't believe my story, I'm sorry, but I have all the scars and medical records to prove it. My father sold the house and arranged an apartment for my mother in Owen Sound, which is half an hour from where I grew up in Meaford, Ontario, Canada. My father asked if I wanted to see my mother one more time before I left, and I agreed. That was about 7 days before I left, and since I was in town, we went there. When I got there, I knocked on the door. My mother opened it but didn't even look at me. She knew it was me, but didn't make eye contact. I walked in, she started walking, and I followed her to her bedroom. She sat on the bed, took a letter from the nightstand, handed it to me, laid back down, and started. I said, "I'm not doing this," and immediately walked out, starting to shake. My dad asked how it had been, but I didn't even answer. I think I only read the letter when I got to California. At that time, I really didn't understand the content, and over the last 40 years, with so many changes, I ended up storing the letter somewhere and don't know where it is. I think about including it one day in the third and final volume of my book, making a copy and showing it exactly as she wrote it because it was very strange. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time because it seemed like more of the same, but now I believe there is something in it that needs to be examined. There might definitely be something very interesting there, whether it makes sense or not, but it is worth revisiting. I will include this letter in the final book. I remember a part that I read, which irritated me at the time. "Don't be a wild man." That's where I stopped reading and stored the letter. I haven't seen it in about 30 years, but I know I have it stored somewhere, and I will find it. While we were going through this, we didn't know anything, but I was very afraid of the demonic world. I heard things in the house, saw things, was terrified by the unknown. Did I know what it was? I had no idea. The thing that opened my eyes was a dual process. When I reached my 30s, I was having a lot of difficulty with life and thought about taking my own life. I wondered, why am I like this? What is wrong with me? Then I started thinking about my childhood and researching. I don't know how it happened, but I ended up finding the records of the case of Annalisa Michel in the 70s, a case of exorcism. I studied all the recordings and transcripts available, and everything I read and heard from the testimonies was exactly like my mother's case. The same things, the same phrases. When I studied all this, I realized, wow, this explains everything. No need to force any connection. It was like reading about my mother. The descriptions of the witnesses, the screams, the repetitive movements, all the same. Then, I started researching other cases of exorcism and demonic possession and discovered that all of them share common characteristics. For example, I heard my mother speak in many different voices, which helped me identify speech patterns, even in German in the case of Annalise Michel. All these patterns were identical, and this was shocking to me. As I explored more cases and listened to more testimonies, the pieces of the puzzle fit together, and I concluded that my mother was possessed not by one, but by a legion of demonic entities. These spirits, from the Nephilim, from the fallen of the antediluvian world, follow the same speech patterns, have the same hatred, and even use the same phrases in all the real exorcism cases I investigated with transcriptions or audio available. They were exactly like my mother. I realized that there was more to life than just my perception after many years. I had just gotten married, and after 3 months, my wife and I separated. She called me saying she was pregnant, and my world crumbled. I thought, not only do I have psychological issues, but I'm going to harm another generation, my own child. I couldn't bear it. One day, while I was going to visit her after giving her my car and everything I had, feeling very guilty, I was on a bus on Ventura Boulevard near Taft High School and started crying in front of about 40 people. I said, God, whoever you are, I've made a mess of my life. Please come into my life and fix things. I will serve you. At that exact moment, I didn't hear a voice, I didn't see a light, but I felt a peace inside me. And I know that was the moment the angels rejoiced in heaven, because that's what they say when a sinner repents. When I turned my face back to the people watching me cry, I smiled at them, not understanding what had happened to me. When I arrived at my bus stop, I got off, ran to my wife's house, knocked on the door, and told her, not fully understanding, something happened to me and I don't know what it is. We got back together a week later, and I told her that I had a tremendous desire to know God. Then I went and rented the movie Jesus of Nazareth. While I watched, my wife was in the kitchen. In the movie, when Jesus says that the sheep know his voice, I immediately felt that he was who I had encountered on the bus. A week later, I asked a friend who went to church which church he attended, and I went there the following week. The pastor, David Miller, said in his sermon that we need to be born again. He read the passage with Nicodemus where Jesus says that we should not marvel at needing to be born again. It's like the wind which we do not know where it comes from or where it goes. I turned to my wife and said, that's what happened to me. I was born again. From that moment, my wife also gave her heart to the Lord, and months later, through my influence, each of her family members over the years became born-again Christians. It's a beautiful story, and at the same time painful, for what I had to go through and where it led me. It gave me an inner peace, as Jesus says, a peace that the world cannot give. Now, I don't worry about death, fame, or wealth, because that day on the bus, I found a precious pearl, and I gave everything I had to possess it, knowing that everything else pales in comparison. I still deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. It's horrible. Sometimes I ask God to take me because I don't know if I can continue. But as long as God wants me to tell this story, I hope that by doing so, someone out there has the courage to stand up and say, I believe in Christ, I believe in Jesus, and I will fight against it, because the enemy only wants to destroy. Maybe there is someone watching today who has a similar story, and knowing they are not alone, finds some comfort. The most important lesson here is that God can take you from anywhere, no matter how low you see yourself or how little value you think you have. You are wrong, because Christ can take anyone from anywhere, clean you up, dress you in white garments, and invite you to live with him in heaven. There is no one so far away that they cannot be reached by the hand of God. That is what repentance and forgiveness mean. He says he will cast out all your sins, and they will no longer be remembered. You will be pure as snow. This is what I had to face, thinking I had no value. But in the end, the crowns of this world don't matter. They are thrown at the feet of the King of Kings. No matter how low you see yourself or how worthless you think you are, the God who created you in the heavens has such a deep and valuable love for you that he gave his only son to die the worst possible torment on this planet so that you and I can go to heaven. That is what every man's story is about. Before I conclude, I want to leave you with some questions to reflect on. How is your life today? Is there something holding you back, like the past pain or lack of direction? Maybe you feel that you have no value or that nobody cares about you. But remember, God can change any situation. The story you just heard shows that no matter how dark your reality seems, there is hope in Christ. Have you given your life to him? What stops you from doing it right now? Challenge yourself to take the first step towards a new life. What do you need to do to leave the past behind and allow God to transform your present? Don't delay any longer. Share your answers here in the comments, because I want to walk with you on this journey of transformation. And if you want to continue learning more about how Jesus can change lives, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Let's pursue this spiritual growth together.
I couldn't continue in this marriage knowing that God didn't bless it and that I was sleeping next to a demon. It was too disturbing. I saw his face turn demonic. But I still loved him. I prayed to God to remove him, but not to break my heart. I didn't want to suffer from the separation. It wasn't long after we filed for divorce. A few days later, I started waking up with the worst headaches I've ever had in my life. My whole body began to hurt a lot. I asked him to take me to the emergency room or emergency care, and he took a long time to do that. It was then that I remembered the $1 million life insurance. He would receive $500,000 from it, and everything started to make sense. That was why he was doing this. As I was suffocating, I saw Jesus again, but this time only up to the knees. I could see his robe and his hand reaching out to me. At that point, I wanted to go with Jesus. I was ready to leave.
If you felt moved by this testimony and want to watch this story and more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here, we share powerful experiences that can transform lives and strengthen faith. Click the subscribe button, activate the notification bell to receive updates, and join our community of faith and hope.